My name's Fergus. You'll be hearing later on from my colleague Holly. We are from National Research Group, which, despite the name, is a global research agency specializing in the intersection of content, culture, and technology. So just quick background on our firm. We were founded in the 1970s, specializing in TV and film research. Still an area we do a lot of work in. We have diversified considerably since then. We do a lot of work now with most of the major streaming platforms, in gaming, in sports, increasingly in the creator economy as well, really working across pretty much all forms of scripted and unscripted entertainment. We are not, unlike some of the firms you'll be hearing from this week, we are not a specialist kids and families firm, but it is an area that we have a lot of expertise in across many of those different content verticals. And in our session today, we're going to be drawing on some of that expertise to walk through some of our recent work in this space, not only to illuminate some of the key trends shaping the way that kids and teenagers today are growing up, but also as a way of illustrating some of the power of new technologies like AI in unlocking new ways of understanding this audience. I'm sure, as many of you have experienced, this is an audience that can be difficult to reach through traditional methods. They bring with them a whole host of challenges in trying to understand them, trying to reach them where they are. So we think there are some really powerful applications for artificial intelligence in helping to unlock kind of new ways of understanding what really matters to younger audiences today. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the findings from a piece of research we published a few months ago in partnership with an organization called Young Storytellers. They are a charity based in Los Angeles that run creative writing workshops for kids and teenagers. And the central question of this research is a very simple one. How have the cultural and technological trends of the 21st century reshaped what it means to grow up and to navigate the world as a young person? Of course, we know the past 25 years has been a period of enormous disruption to the way that we consume media, the way that we engage with content. We've seen over that period the growth of smartphones and tablets, the streaming revolution, the explosive rise of online video and social media. And as a result, today's kids are plugged into an always-on ecosystem of digital content. And at the same time, they've also had to grow up in a world defined in many ways by a series of crises and threats, from COVID-19 to climate change, from wars in Europe and the Middle East to rising tides of political extremism and polarization. So the goal of this research was really to understand the net impact of all of those trends over that period on shaping the worldviews and the priorities of young people, and also look at what that's going to mean for Gen Alpha as a demographic cohort as they continue to grow up. And as I mentioned earlier, we also wanted to use this research as a proof of concept for using artificial intelligence to unlock new levels of insight about this audience. And this is where our partnership with Young Storytellers proved so important, because it meant we could actually begin this research with an analysis of stories written by kids themselves. This archive of around 7,000 stories written by kids and teenagers participating in their workshops over the last 20 years. So we took that archive, we developed an iterative process for using AI models to parse those stories and extract meaningful insights from them. We developed hypotheses to create a set of prompts that we could apply to evaluate each of those stories. We manually tested those in batches to ensure we were generating consistent and reliable outputs. And then we ran that whole archive through AI models at scale in order to convert this huge unstructured data source into a mapped set of themes and topics that we could start extracting insights from. And at the end of all of that, we then used that analysis to inform the design of a custom quantitative study among kids and teenagers, surveying 1,500 kids and teens ages 6 to 17, as well as 500 parents of young kids, exploring their content preferences, their consumption habits, and the way they see the world. For cross-generational comparisons, we've also drawn on a few of our other data sources available at NRG, some of our larger tracking programs and syndicated research products. I should say as well up front, given that this came out of a partnership with an American charity, the data that we're going to be looking at here today is mostly US focused, but we have seen in a lot of our larger tracking programs that many of these trends are impacting kids here in the UK as well, and maybe later on we can get into some of the granularities and differences there too. But in the rest of today's session, we're going to be walking you through the key findings of that research, focusing really on three key themes that stood out to us as the most important drivers in reshaping the experience of childhood over the past 25 years. We'll start by looking at the role of technology in kids' lives, the way in which their devices and their platforms shape the way they see the world, shape their relationships with others. Then we'll look at the cultural context in which they're growing up and this sense that so many young people have that they're growing up in an era defined by constant crises of one kind or another. And then finally, we'll explore the media diets of kids and teens and the way in which they're creating unique cultural identities for themselves in a world of seemingly infinite entertainment options. And as we go through each of these themes, we'll try to explore some of the ways in which we can learn from this, what this all means for us as storytellers, trying to create content that truly resonates with the values of Gen Alpha. But we have to start with technology, right? Because this is often the very first thing that comes up when we talk about Gen Alpha, to the extent that the term iPad kid has become a popular, if somewhat derogatory, way of describing them. And as you can see here, we did see in our research that there is a degree of truth to that notion. This is a generation that is living their lives through their devices. We see that technology plays a critical role in their lives. It is the primary vehicle through which they get to connect with others, through which they get to create a sense of personal identity and community for themselves. So you can see on the chart here, digital forms of interaction are now the most common ways in which young people interact with their friends outside of seeing each other at school. So in other words, digital venues like group chats, social media platforms, video game lobbies even, have in many ways supplanted in-person spaces as the primary venue for socialization, the primary venue in which kids get to spend time with their friends. Having said all of that, I think it would be a mistake to think of this generation as one that is hopelessly addicted to their screens, scrolling simply for the sake of scrolling. Because the reality is that reliance on technology, that isn't something they chose for themselves. It's the product of a whole set of shifting cultural norms around how we are raising our kids. I think this chart here does a good job of illustrating that. So you can see how over the past few generations, parents have become more cautious about allowing their kids to spend time unsupervised in the real world, while at the same time giving them freer access to the digital world. And actually, Gen Alpha is now the first generation that is being given mobile phones before their parents trust them to spend time on their own at home unsupervised. But it isn't just about the decisions of individual parents either. If we look more broadly at our social landscape, you can see some of the ways in which offline socialization is becoming harder and harder for young people. Participation in youth sports, for example, has been steadily declining since at least 2010, partly because of rising costs for equipment, rising costs for training that have priced out many families. Youth clubs and after-school programs, we all know, have been chronically underfunded both here in the UK and over in the US. And even public spaces like shopping centres and parks are becoming increasingly hostile to unaccompanied kids. There's simply fewer venues these days in which kids can safely spend time with peers their age, interacting with them outside of school hours. We can also see this shift towards digital forms of socialization reflected in Young Storytellers' archive. So back in 2010, kids were writing about video games and about sports in their stories in roughly equal numbers. But over time, the gap between the two topics has increased. And last year, kids were about 3 times more likely to write about video games than they were to write about sports when given this creative writing opportunity. You can also see on this chart here the visible impact of the pandemic around 2021, that notable dip in stories about sports, just one of many examples of the way in which the pandemic amplified and accelerated that digitization of childhood. And given that technology plays such an important role in the lives of today's kids and teens, it's easy to see why they would have a broadly positive relationship with it. You can see on the chart here, 2/3 of kids say that technology is a force helping to make the world a better place. Only about 1 in 20 are true techno-pessimists, feel that technology is making the world worse right now. And this is reflected in Young Storytellers' archive as well. So when kids write about technology in their stories, which is pretty often, they mostly do so in a way that is broadly positive. They tend to frame it as an entertainment option or a way of solving problems rather than as a source of conflict or a source of tension. That said, that archive analysis does also, however, reveal a persistent gender divide in terms of how kids approach technology. Boys are overall much more likely to write about technology than girls, and when they do write about the topic, they're more likely to do so in a positive way. You can see here in 2024, for example, about 75% of stories about technology by boys were positive, had a positive tone, compared to only around 20% of stories by girls. Girls were more likely to approach technology in their stories in either a value-neutral way or to explore the more negative consequences of technology, so more likely to write about issues like cyberbullying or social media addiction, for example. This metric does fluctuate quite a lot year on year. I don't want to read too much into 2024, any one year in particular, but you can see the trend here does seem to be towards even greater divergence between the sexes. So it's interesting, some of these ways in which even at a very young age, we're subtly imparting some very gendered messages about technology onto our kids. But even though kids and boys in particular have a mostly positive relationship with technology, they are still keen to find more room for offline socialization within their lives, more room for real-world interactions with their peers. We asked kids directly, do you prefer interacting with your friends in person or through a screen? 45% said they prefer in-person interaction, more than twice the number that said they preferred digital interactions. And you can see on the chart here, the young people we surveyed showed a strong desire to spend more of their time on in-person activities like hanging out with friends, participating in group activities, or playing video games together in the same physical space. So in other words, there's this really interesting disconnect between how kids are currently spending their time and what they would actually like to be doing. And as Gen Alpha grows up, as they become able to exert more control over their lives, we should expect to see them look to shift that balance between online and offline activities, looking to use technology as a way to facilitate rather than replace real-world interactions. And of course, another implication of all of this, this critical role that technology plays in the lives of today's kids and teens, is that we here within the entertainment industry need to really understand that role so that it can be authentically portrayed back to them in media targeted towards this age group. Right now, fewer than 3 in 10 kids, for example, think that movies and TV shows generally do a good job of showing how people their age are using social media. Of course, there are some shows out there that have cracked the code, that have figured out how to do this. We explored some of that in this research. For younger kids, Bluey emerged as a show that they felt really did understand the relationship they have with their devices. That's a show, of course, that's done multiple episodes about Bluey and Bingo and their relationship with tablets and other electronic devices. For older kids and teenagers, perhaps concerningly, Euphoria emerged as the show that they said really understood kids' relationship with technology, and you can make of that what you will. But ultimately, it is clear that we, within the industry, need to do a better job of more authentically portraying the way that kids use technology, the way that they use social media within their day-to-day lives. So I'll pause there, hand over to Holly to walk through the second and third key themes of this research.
Great. So yeah, we're now going to spend some time unpacking kids' experiences within the wider cultural and even geopolitical context in which they're growing up. And in particular, we're going to focus on this idea of permacrisis, so the sense that a lot of young people have today that we're living in a period of history that is defined by a constant lurching between one crisis and another. So apologies if some of the insights in this section are a bit depressing, especially with some sore heads in the room, but I'll try to end on an optimistic note at least. So looking at the data, it's clear, unfortunately, that kids and teenagers today are deeply worried about the state of our society and the planet. They feel that the world is becoming more dangerous than it is safe. They think society is becoming more unequal, and they believe the health of the environment is deteriorating. And of course, this all makes sense when we think about the news media they're exposed to, even at a young age, and particularly through their social media channels. From climate change to natural disasters, political instability, wars in Gaza and Ukraine, today's kids are being exposed to a constant and largely unfiltered stream of images and videos showing the world seemingly falling apart around them. And again, this is an area where the pandemic created a critical inflection point. So if we look at stories within the Young Storytellers archive, and in particular how kids are choosing to end their stories, we can see a noticeable shift begin around 2021, where the percentage of stories with unambiguously happy endings begins to decline, and stories with neutral or even negative endings start to become more common. And we think that in many ways, COVID really helped to crystallize many of the other fears that kids and teenagers have about the state of the world. You know, it provided a very concrete example of how you can go from 1 minute reading about a news story on the other side of the world to suddenly having your own life completely upended. And while kids are deeply worried about the state of the world, so too are their parents. Almost 2/3 of parents believe the world is more dangerous today than when they were growing up as kids. A majority also believe that it's harder to raise kids these days and that people are just less connected to one another. And we talked earlier about the broadly positive relationship that kids have with technology, but for parents, it's very much the opposite. In their mind, new devices, new platforms have simply created new dangers that they now have to keep their kids safe from, and new threats that they need to watch out for. So given these fears around the world, both kids' own fears and displaced anxieties from their parents, children are looking to fiction as a source of relief. Today's kids and teens express a strong interest in escapist narratives. They're looking for movies and TV shows that have a clear sense of right and wrong, that feature unambiguously happy endings, more so than ones that try to replicate, the messy complexity of the world we live in, the moral ambiguity in which they're growing up. But despite this desire for escapist narratives, young people still need a way to safely work through the real-world issues that are keeping them up at night. And increasingly, we found that kids participating in the Young Storytellers workshops have been using their own stories to do just that. So on this slide, we can see that historically, most kids tend to set their stories in sci-fi or fantasy universes, shown by that top line there, rather than setting them in the real world, which is the bottom line. But the gap between the two has gradually narrowed over the past decade, despite a blip around the time of the pandemic, when obviously the need for escapism was at an all-time high. So we can see kids increasingly looking for outlets that allow them to process their real-world experiences, the real-world issues that they're reading about on their social media feeds. And taken together, this creates a real challenge for the entertainment industry. How do you satisfy young people's desire for escapist storytelling while also giving them a space to safely explore and work through the feelings that they have about these complex real-world issues? In other words, how do you create stories that they can lose themselves in, but that still have something relevant to say about their everyday lives and experiences? And we'll touch upon this idea further at the end of the presentation. So moving on to our third and final theme for today, how young people are navigating a seemingly endless ocean of always-on entertainment content. And now we have to remember that Gen Alpha is the first generation to have never known a world before social media. They're the first to have grown up after the streaming revolution and the boom in online video content of the 2010s. Just like us, they have access to almost any form of media they could ever want, all, a click of a button away and available entirely on their own schedules. But this is very much the norm for them. And this can be something of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, it means that kids now have access to content that reflects every passion, every interest they could possibly have, no matter how niche. But at the same time, when you have access to so much content, it can be much harder to find the content that truly matters. And perhaps more importantly, it makes it extremely challenging for Gen Alpha to create its own sense of shared generational culture. And that's why social video platforms like YouTube and TikTok are so important for this generation. They're one of the primary sources of cultural trends and unifying cultural narratives. And the celebrities that emerge from these platforms play a hugely significant role in defining what Gen Alpha culture looks like. As a side note, we did some recent work on masculinity and male role models and found that for boys under 13, Mr. Beast was far and away their biggest role model, more so than any other athlete, any actor, any type of celebrity. It's all about Mr. Beast. And when we talk about this idea of content overload, it's not just the number of options that young people have available to them, it's also the fact that they're typically consuming multiple streams of content simultaneously. So most of the time when kids and teens are watching movies and TV shows at home or playing video games, they're also using a secondary device at the same time. And from this study, we also found that almost a fifth of teenagers told us they even use their phones while watching movies in cinemas, which is possibly the most upsetting statistic for me from this study. But when it comes to shaping today's culture among kids and teens, it's actually video games that play the biggest role, even more so than social video platforms. So when we look at the type of media that kids talk about the most with their friends, it's video games that top the list. Online creator content is second, but both are well ahead of movies and TV series. And similarly, when we explore the individual franchises that kids spend the most time talking about, that list is again dominated by video game titles. And perhaps no surprise, there are 3 gaming franchises that stand out from the rest as core pillars of Gen Alpha culture: Roblox, Minecraft, and Fortnite. And so on this slide, we're looking at data from NRG's Franchise IQ tracker, which measures brand identity for entertainment IPs across film, TV, gaming, and other forms of media. So the brand's popularity is shown here on the x-axis. It's a composite score. It looks at awareness, familiarity, and love for the brand. And then the brand's power measure is on the y-axis, another composite score that looks at the franchise's ability to grow and move forward, based on factors such as how interested are people in seeing new content, how excited are they to engage across different touch points. And we can see here that these 3 platforms have all seen strong momentum among teens over the last 3 years. They already started in a very strong place, and it's only getting stronger. Of course, all 3 of these are specifically social gaming platforms, games where the emphasis is on creative self-expression and collaboration with friends and other players. And we think this speaks to a broader trend that we're starting to see among today's kids and teens, the desire to be more than simply passive consumers of content, a longing for a greater sense of agency over their entertainment diets, and an interest in new models of fandom that's really kind of blurring the lines between consumption and creation. I think the phenomenal success of the Minecraft movie at the box office only serves to emphasize how important this ethos of community and co-creation is to young audiences. Now, it's very easy in the face of endless oceans of content to feel a sense of powerlessness, particularly when so much of the media you're exposed to is determined by a faceless algorithm that feels outside of your control. I feel like I went too far here, but we'll just leave this slide. Compared to older consumers, young people are actually more likely... I'll get back here. Young people are more likely to feel like they rely heavily on algorithms to discover content, shown by the red bars on the left, but also they're more likely to be concerned about the implications that this has for their privacy and their sense of autonomy online, shown by the bars on the right. And that's why we think we're starting to see young people push back on this sort of algorithmization of entertainment. They're saying, I don't want you to dictate what I'm going to watch, what I'm going to be interested in. I want to express myself, my personality through the content that I choose to engage with. And so, for example, we're seeing a lot of older shows regain popularity. Things like Suits and Grey's Anatomy are developing almost a new life on social media. And it's also why many young people are turning to international genres like anime. They're all expressions of the same desire for empowered fandom, a desire to assert this generation's capacity to discover content on their own terms, to create their own unique generational identity, rather than only engaging with things that, media executives decide that they should be engaging with. And now I'll hand over to Fergus, and I will go on to this slide to wrap up.
Thank you. We've looked there at some of the major trends reshaping the experience of childhood. Just before we wrap up today, we wanted to recap with what this all tells us at a macro level about who Gen Alpha are, what their priorities are. I think one of the big themes we've seen running through all of this research has been the idea of a generation being pushed and pulled in multiple directions at once, navigating a whole series of paradoxes and contradictions. This is a generation that is almost constantly online, who rely heavily on digital forms of interaction, but they still appreciate the value of in-person time with their friends. They want to create more room for it in their lives. They prioritize escapist storytelling that features morally unambiguous heroes and villains, but they still need safe spaces and healthy outlets to work through all of the complex real-world issues they're dealing with in their day-to-day lives. And while they are deeply worried about the state of our planet, the state of society, thankfully, they haven't given up hope. They are ready to face those problems head on. They're looking to new technology in particular as a source of optimism. Ultimately, this is a generation highly attuned to the fact that they are growing up in an uncertain world, beset by complex dangers and challenges, and seeking a greater sense of agency and autonomy for themselves in the face of all of those challenges. And what does that all mean for us here today within the entertainment industry? What can we take away from this? Personally, I think it comes down to 5 key lessons. Firstly, we need to up our game when it comes to fictional portrayals of how young people use technology and social media. Young people are tired of seeing the same tropes over and over again. They want more room for nuance, more room for depth, more room for stories that authentically capture both the positive and the negative role that these technologies play in their everyday lives. Next, we have to find the right balance between providing kids with opportunities for escapism while still acknowledging the challenges and the difficulties they face day to day. And often the best way to do that is through metaphor, through abstraction, creating those safe spaces, those fictional universes that feel removed from but still relevant to kids' real lives. At the same time, we also need to be embracing models of empowered fandom. For example, creating digital experiences that allow kids to freely and easily browse through international content libraries, historical content libraries, discover new favorites for themselves. And relatedly, we need to be embracing this generation's deep-rooted sense of creativity. We've seen on social gaming platforms, as Holly mentioned, the interest they have in these new models of fandom that sort of blur the lines between consumption and creation. And now we're seeing new technologies like AI open up even more creative opportunities for young people to express themselves. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to ensure that we keep the voices of young people themselves at the heart of this conversation, pushing ourselves both as creatives but also as researchers to find new ways of uncovering their voices, their perspectives, bringing those perspectives into the rooms where decisions are being made. And hopefully, if we've achieved anything today, we've shown you the value of exploring new techniques, exploring new methodologies to unlock those perspectives, the way that that can really help us elevate how we understand this audience, how we can create content that truly resonates with them. We'll pause there. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions.
Hello there, I'm Paul Powell from Black Dog Television. You talked a lot about this information mainly coming from America. Did you pick up any difference between American and UK audiences?
So it's something we're continuing to research in the UK. We're hoping to do some further work building on this in the UK. I will say, based on some of our long-term trackers, where we look at kids and teens, we generally see quite a lot of similarities between perspectives in the US and the UK. I think that's also a result of the flattening of culture from digital media, social media over the last decade or so. We don't necessarily see as much geographical diversity among younger audiences as we do among older audiences. And certainly, I think the trends that we've looked at today, I'm sure we can all think about instantiations of how this applies here in the UK specifically. But as I say, it is something that we're continuing to research here at NRG, hoping to look more into that over the coming months. I don't know, Holly, if you had anything to add to that?
No, I think that covers it.
Thank you very much. I thought it was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.